20 slides, that's it. 20 seconds a slide, and it's going to move automatically, so no control. That's part of the fun of it. Let's see, he has a Master of Architecture degree from Princeton. He worked as a project architect at Lake Plato, still does, still there. One of our favorite firms. Let's see, he has held visiting and adjunct professorships at a number of schools, including the University of Texas at Arlington, Texas Tech, and Trinity in San Antonio. He's also a contributing writer, and a really important one, to Texas Architect Magazine. He's currently engaged in a project, and this is going to be really cool, a project to document and analyze the courthouses of Central Texas, a project which will result in a book set to be published in 2013. Brantley Hightower, and are you ready to go?
So a little while ago, I had the opportunity to travel to Florida to see the launch of a space shuttle. Now, this was something I'd wanted to do ever since I was a little person, and it turns out it's just as cool as the little version of me thought it would be. Unfortunately, it did drive home the cruel fact that as cool as architecture may be, spaceflight is in fact much, much cooler. So after a brief existential crisis in which I thought again about maybe going into the profession of aerospace engineering, I went back and sort of read through the old research I had done as a young person about the American space program, the development from the early Mercury space flights up into the International Space Station. And one of the things I noticed coming at it again was I was coming at it from the perspective of a designer. And something that I found to be quite interesting is that the act of designing a spacecraft is actually not that dissimilar from designing a building. Both are iterative processes that require sort of the development of multiple schemes and the execution of those schemes and the testing of those schemes. The only major difference being that in the case of spacecraft, the models that you produce are actually, again, much, much cooler. And as with any great sort of mid-century modern design, the form is indicative of the function. The Apollo command module, for example, is cone-shaped, regarding the fact that it has to fly through the atmosphere, whereas the lunar module, which only acts in the vacuum of space, has no such generating formal principles. Now, in doing this research, one sort of thing I uncovered that I hadn't before was an endeavor called the Apollo Applications Program. And so what this was, in the mid-60s, when NASA was well on its way to landing a man on the moon, they took a step back and thought, wow, we've created a lot of really cool hardware for this very specific purpose. But that's not the only use it could be put to. It could, in fact, fulfill many other missions. And so the question was asked, now that we have all of these wonderful toys, what other games can we play with them? And so some of the ideas the report came out with were fairly mundane, sort of simple sort of extensions of the moon landing program that had already been proposed, but also expanded to a manned Venus flyby. It turns out that flying to Venus is actually relatively simple. It's landing there that's a little bit more complicated. And with only slightly modifying existing 1960s era hardware, this is something we could have done in 1972, excuse me. Unfortunately, NASA's budget got cut, and some of the more ambitious ideas were scaled back. One that was kept was taking the third stage of a moon rocket, draining the fuel out of it and using that as a space station. That's the Skylab space station that actually was almost as big as the International Space Station that's up there now. Now, what I found interesting about this process was how it inverted the traditional design process. Instead of taking a purpose and finding a design to fit it, you start with a design and find a purpose to, let me try that again. Instead of having a purpose and finding a design to fit it, you start with a design and find a purpose to work backwards towards. And this is where I see the parallel with architecture. We live in a world that is littered with architectural hardware that was built for a very specific purpose, but that purpose has often been outdated. And so one of the challenges for us as a profession is to find a way to reuse these buildings in a way that is intelligent. Now, obviously, this is not a new idea. The Alamo, as many of you know, started out as a mission church before it was repurposed as a tourist attraction. What I find to be interesting about the Apollo Applications Program is how it takes sort of the failings of the original design and finds a way to sort of make that a generative part of the future design. Another good example is the Bankside power plant. This was a power plant in London that was built right after World War II. And even after it had been decommissioned as a power plant, there was sort of talk of tearing it down, but instead they converted it into a museum, the Tate Museum. And you have this sort of ginormous turbine hall in the center, which is essentially a big empty hall. But what it created was the opportunity for installation artists to create incredible, vastly scaled installations that couldn't have been imaginable in a much smaller scale. So this is an idea that has permeated some of my work as well. I just finished work on a competition to rethink a use for an abandoned hospital in Chicago. The floor plates of this particular hospital were small, and the rooms were of a scale that they became obsolete. And so I tried to turn that around and use this sort of small-scale spaces as this vast children's playland with great slides and bouncy castles that would sort of exploit that smaller scale. And then on top of that was built a YMCA, sort of oriented vertically, so it creates this sort of community center in the heart of the near north side of Chicago. Another project is thought to rethink the standard suburban strip retail development. This was sponsored by the Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art. And the idea here was to leverage two things that particular city has lots of, specifically strip malls and old people. So the idea was to rethink these strip malls as end-of-life centers. So kind of imagine them as a combination hospice and funeral home. The idea being that when guests would shuffle off this mortal coil, they would be buried in what was originally the parking lot, and after that had been reached capacity, the entire site would be cleared and replanted as public parkland. The idea being that over the span of several decades, you see this mass transformation of the city of Scottsdale from a series of commercial strips into a vast series of linear parks. Shockingly, they did not take me up on this idea. But an idea, much like a building or a spacecraft, is something that you can plan for, but ultimately you have to send off into the world. And if you're lucky, someone else will pick up that idea and take it further and maybe even change the world in the end. And that is pretty cool. Thank you.